Welcome to Good News from St. Andrews, Guelph. My name is the Reverend John Borthwick, and I am delighted to be with you today to share this good news that we have to share. I want to start the episode today and this introduction with just a shout out to a couple of people I saw in person who are connected to our community in some way. I want to say hello to Doreen and Margaret, who I met in person. Just sort of our paths crossed. What is that like to see people in person? Amazing, right? To see and have a conversation with someone in person. Man, so good, so good. And I heard from Doreen that it's her birthday, probably when this episode airs or when we see this episode. She'll either have had her birthday or it's coming. It's around this time. So happy birthday, Doreen. I wish we could be together as a community to celebrate that with you. Because we would, but I know there's also people in your life who will celebrate you very well, and I'm so grateful that that's happening for you. You could say that Doreen, she let me know, she's been a watcher of St. Andrews, you might say, for 67 years. Amazing. I'm assuming that means she's only 68. So happy birthday this week, Doreen. All the best to you and to your family. Today's episode, I want to say, is brought to you by the letter E. And I'm going to try to make it a shorter episode because we've got a lot happening on Sunday morning, and I want to be able to include some of that in this week's Rogers episode. Brought to you by the letter E. 3 E words I want to share with you that are profoundly important as a part of the Christian community and certainly the Presbyterian community as we tell the story of God and celebrate the good news we have. First E letter, Exodus. Exodus is a word that you need to know if you're going to fully connect to the themes and the stories that are shared in the fullness of the story of God that we find in the Bible. And the Exodus story actually has its own chapter. It's pretty easy. It's the second chapter of the whole Bible. So they would call that the Hebrew Bible, and it's the second chapter, Exodus, and it tells the story of the Hebrew people being put into bondage, into slavery by the Egyptian Empire. And in their slavery, they cry out to God and ask God to deliver them from slavery. This bondage happens for several generations. And I always look to that story, the Exodus story, as one thing around how we understand hope. The story goes that they cried out to God in their slavery. God heard their cry, and God liberated them from slavery. But the fullness of that story is it took generations for God to either hear or God to be able to respond to their cry. Sometimes we are hoping for things that may not be beneficial specifically to us. And maybe that's what the profound definition of hope could be. We hope for something that might change in our world, in our culture, in our society, that we may never reap the benefits of. That's a profound and deep kind of hope. And so the Exodus story is an important one because it reminds people foundationally that God is a God who hears our cries, that God is a God who responds to that. And for the Jewish community, you'll hear them even say in parts of their storytelling and how they worship, "We were slaves in Egypt, and you heard our cry, and you liberated us from our bondage." Well, people living in 2021 in Guelph are certainly not slaves in Egypt, but that story is pretty impactful for their lives. Next E word, exile. Exile is the other huge arc story that is contained within the story of God, and it's about another kind of bondage, thing that happens after being conquered by the Babylonian Empire. Within the Mediterranean thousands of years ago, all these different empires come along, just basically conquer each other, one after the other, till we get the Romans, where Jesus exists and has his story and his life. But before that, there's the Babylonian Empire that conquers Israel, that was then a country, as it were, conquers them. And when it conquers them, not only does it conquer them, defeat them, and do all sorts of bad things that conquering empires do. They destroy the temple of God in Jerusalem. Destroy it. The house of God, as the people of Israel understood it at that time. And they take essentially the elites, the thinkers, the prophets, the scholars, the priests, the government officials, the bureaucrats. They take them away on a long journey to the capital city of Babylon, where they're forced to live in exile. And that story is, again, a similar story to Exodus, but it's foundational in a different way. Because when you're taken to exile, you're taken away from your home, a home you once knew and a home that was once familiar. They destroyed the temple of God, the place where the people of Israel believed God lived and existed. And by doing that destruction, they essentially destroyed and disrupted their whole access, how they understood who God was and where their relationship was and how transactional that was. If you have God living in a house, you go visit God. That's how you connect with your spirituality, with your way of connecting deeply with your relationship with God. If that's destroyed, the exile has to help them to figure that time away from home, has to help them to figure out, how do we connect with God now? Where is God, and how is that relationship working? It also has a similar story in the sense to the Exodus, where we hear often in the story of God, people are crying and upset by being in exile, by the rivers of Babylon kind of way of speaking. We're crying out to God, and God responds using actually another empire, the Persian Empire, to release them from their exile and send them on their way back home. And they do eventually come home. And that'll be one of the stories we're going to talk about in our worship service today. Last E word, elders. Maybe you didn't know, but Presbyterian actually is from a Greek word called presbyteros, which means elders. And all it really means is that as Presbyterians, we are governed by elders, ruling and teaching elders. I'm a teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I'm a minister. Ruling elders are basically our board of directors, who sort of has governance and authority within our church. And within that, there's this court structure. We have sessions, we call them, in a local congregation. A larger regional body is called a synod, that's a really large regional body. And then a smaller regional body is called a presbytery, made up of teaching and ruling elders, representation. And then we have something called General Assembly, which is 1/6 of the church meets every year to discuss all the big things of what we are as Presbyterians. And that's, again, ministers and ruling elders. Well, on Sunday, we are ordaining, and again, big word, setting apart is the kind of idea. People who've been called out from our community, who our community said, we think these people would make good leaders in our community. And so we're calling them out and we're setting them apart, ordaining them to become elders. And so we've got a few new elders joining us this Sunday, and we're doing that part of our service in person, socially distant, and a variety of precautions will be taken as we do that. So we are celebrating the E words this Sunday, and just to keep those E words in mind as you think about the stories you hear, because sometimes guys like me will casually mention words like Exodus and exile, and you might be sitting there going, what does that even mean? I don't even know. Is that a story from somewhere? What is it? I don't get it. Is that movie with Paul Newman? I don't know. What are we talking about here? So Exodus, we were slaves in Egypt. God heard our cry, and God freed and liberated us from our bondage. Exodus is a wonderful and powerful story of how God listens to us. Exile, we're taken away from our home. We live by the rivers of Babylon. We have to figure out who we are again. And in the midst of that, God hears our cry, uses somebody beyond us to help us to find our way home again. God will help us find our way home. So this week, it's a service from September the 19th. Our sermon, our title, or our text for the Sunday is Ezra chapter 3, verses 10 to 13 in the story of God. Ezra's a pretty tiny book, so you might have to really flip through some of those pages or search it online. And like I say, we've got an ordination of elders, and it's going to be a fun and exciting time of celebration in our community in church. And I hope we can see some of that as a part of our episode to share with you today on Rogers. So, as always, may you experience more good news today than bad.